already. I didn't think so.
I don't think
Yes,
it's necessary. It's just like when you're using unfamiliar words for people. You can include context clues within what you're doing. You just give people context clues, and they don't necessarily have to know who that person is, as long as you tell them why they're important.
Yeah.
And they need to be important for your story to include them, right?
Okay.
So if you say, you talk about them and you make it obvious that this is a group from the '60s, an important group from the '60s, then people are pretty comfortable. Go to YouTube and pull up a YouTube video and see if they're not worried about it.
I love the internet.
But you just give them enough context clues that they get the important part.
All right, gentleman in the middle, and then you.
My wife was at a Paul McCartney concert, and a couple of gals in front of her were talking about, gee, wasn't Paul in some band before that? Yeah, Wings. It was in Wings. They didn't even know about the Beatles.
Well, we're running out of Beatles.
Yes, there have to be half of them are dead.
It happens.
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, if I run across a reference to something, I'll look it up on Google if I'm not familiar with it. But I do have a question. I'm working on a historical horror story, set in Seattle, 1890s, 1900s-ish, and it started as just a short story for an event. And the more I try to research it and research the era and research all the really creepy stuff that was actually going on at that point in time, the more I start wanting to stick things in. So it's gone from like a 5,000 word story to it's kind of ballooning up into 10,000 words and beyond. And as I work and add little bits and pieces, when do I stop and say enough, or do I just roll with it?
Depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. The White City. Somebody read The White City. It's about the first serial killer. It's also about the Chicago World's Fair.
Awesome.
And it's kind of like a chapter on the serial killer, a chapter on the World's Fair, a chapter on the serial killer who hunted during the World's Fair, and going back and forth like that. And it's wonderful. Or the book about the racehorse, Seabiscuit. If you read the Seabiscuit, that's exactly what it is. Here's a story, a chapter of a story, a chapter of history, a chapter of story, a chapter of history. I don't know that anybody's done that with a fictional story, but I don't see why you couldn't.
Okay.
Keeping the idea in your head of the story you want to tell up front is important.
Yeah, it's like totally spiraling out of control and turning into.
If you get too many details, then you need to. If they're getting in the way of your story, you need to prune.
Okay.
Say, I'll use you in another story.
That was my thought. Yeah, if the story's growing because of what you're learning, the plot arc and actual action, that's great. If it's just trying to fit in all the cool stuff that the research has turned up, sometimes, we're adding, because I did something like that recently. I did a historical urban fantasy that had World War I and the Red Cross and dog handlers, and I learned way too much about this very small topic, and so little of it went into the book. The cool thing now is with the internet is you can have a web page and you can have a glossary and you can have, diagrams and all of that great stuff. You don't have to just discard it. You can make supplemental stuff. But if it's working for the story, like Patty said, great. But if it's just that the story's still very small and you're padding with the cool stuff, then it might be an issue.
It's growing, and as I play with the story more, it's like, oh, and this is what actually happens to her later on, and and this is the story of the boyfriend, and this is what's going on. Oh, and that's why he did that. Oh, and this and this and this, and she lived over here, and that was, and it's just,
and that's cool.
And it's cool,
that's
but
kind
it's a
of the
little weird.
process.
I didn't
When you start with the story seed, and it's just a bare idea, and when you were talking about how you ended up writing the prequel and the prequel, how do you know when the story's ready to be written? And I go through that process kind of where I chew on it in my mind, and it grows and expands, and it gets bigger and deeper before I ever start, writing the story too. So
the big trick with detail, to the historical detail like that, this is more when I was writing straight fantasy. The big trick to it is to remember the author has to stay out of the screen. And as long as you can stay out of the screen, then it's probably okay. But, the minute the reader says, oh, look, this author did a lot of research on Seattle history, then you've done it wrong. The minute that comes up, then you've done it wrong. If you just immerse them in it, the best historical fantasy horror that I had read in a long time. Those Across the River, which just came out like a year, maybe last year, which is an incredibly good, set in the 1920s, werewolf horror novel. It's not urban fantasy, it is definitely horror. I read the first 10 pages and I thought, my gosh, he's awesome. He set it in the 1920s, and he didn't do it like most people do, where they talk about details that are in the 20s or whatever. It was entirely in the relationship between these two people in the beginning of the book. You could tell it was the 1920s, and that was the most incredible piece of writing I've ever seen, and it was very little historical detail.
Title?
What was the title of that book?
Those Across the River. Very good book.
Everyone back over there is kind of quiet, you have to have some questions. Anyone?
None so far?
Okay. Question over
You
there.
did?
I always have lots of questions.
Well, then
All right, so
there's four of us then.
yeah, and I heard a lot of people say that they'll think of a story and start writing it, and it'll end up to be 250,000 words and all that, and then get pressured to turn it into a few books.
See why that would be 6 months of pain.
That's not me. That's not me. I'm trying to. I'm new. You're supposed to keep it kind of small so they don't spend too many dollars on pages, on paper. But it's one of my frustrating things as a reader is you get to the second book, you may put the first one down, or finish the first one, go off to other books for a year or 2 years, pick the second one up, and you're just kind of picking up in the middle. There's no hook, and you're kind of like 50 pages before I kind of get into some
Congratulations,
good.
you've gotten to be a better writer since you did that part.
Well, yeah,
Right? Yeah,
yeah.
really.
It's just it just right. Yeah.
I've gone back to look at stuff I've written, and I'm very happy I took 10 years off to be an editor. So I'm a far better writer now than I ever was when I started. But I also started reading a lot of fiction that was not written in English originally. So Russian fiction and Japanese fiction. And the way that information is presented is sometimes as interesting as this tablecloth. But other times you're just drawn away from the actual plot because this amazing thing is being described to you and it hits every sense and all these things are going on. You're reading a completely different book inside the book you bought. But it's interesting to get around that.
Patty, what was the author of Those Across the River?
Oh, jeez.
Okay. And the
love that
white.
Devil in the White City.
Devil in the
Eric
White
was.
City.
White City.
Yeah.
He has another one called Thunderstruck that is
Right.
about Tesla and the murder of Crippen.
To the internet.
Is that author?
Oy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Erin. I will.
And small devices
Go-
light up all the
E, I think.
Go be free, and I will go find those who cross the
We live in a
river.
connected world.
Alright. More questions. There's a question.
When editing, how do you decide what's important to keep, what's like superfluous, or what doesn't really,
Well, that's another panel. We have lots of time to talk about editing. I find when editing, if there's anything in a sentence that doesn't